The man who walked into the U.S. Census Bureau in 1906 was a ghost. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knew he no longer officially existed, and his story, which he began to tell the flustered clerk, was so outrageous, so patently impossible, that it should have been dismissed as the ramblings of a madman. He claimed his name was David E. George, and he was, he said, dying. But before he did, he had a confession to make. A secret so profound it would unravel one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. He was not David E. George, he whispered. He was John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln. And he had not been killed in a Virginia barn fire in 1865. He had escaped. This was the beginning of the end of a 40-year deception, a secret history written in shadow, betrayal, and a breathtakingly audacious plot to rewrite the past. To understand the sheer improbability of this claim, one must first journey back to the chaotic, grief-stricken days of April 1865, to the moment the official story insists John Wilkes Booth died. The manhunt was the largest in American history. For 12 days, following the fatal shot in Ford's Theater on April 14th, Union cavalry, detectives, and bloodthirsty citizens scoured the Maryland and Virginia countryside for the most wanted man in the nation. The official War Department report stated that the trail led to a tobacco farm near Port Royal, Virginia, owned by a man named Richard Garrett. There, on the morning of April 26, 1865, Union troops under the command of Lieutenant Everton Conger and Lieutenant Colonel Edward Doherty surrounded a barn where Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, were hiding. The soldiers called for their surrender. Harold, terrified, gave himself up. Booth refused. The barn was set ablaze. As the flames licked at the dry timber, a single shot rang out. A soldier named Boston Corbett, a zealot who claimed he acted on divine instruction, had fired his pistol through a crack in the barn wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He was dragged from the burning structure, paralyzed, and died on the Garrett family's porch 3 hours later, muttering his last words, "Useless, useless." His body was identified by several people who had known him in life, sewn into a horse blanket and buried in a secret grave beneath the stone floor of the Washington Arsenal. The nation was told the assassin was dead. Justice, however rough, had been served. The case was closed. But from the moment that body was pulled from the flames, doubts began to fester. The man who died at Garrett's farm was thin, with a broken leg, and bore a resemblance to Booth. But the identification process was rushed, chaotic, and politically charged. The War Department needed a body. The country needed closure. The alternative theory, the one whispered in saloons and published in sensationalist pamphlets for decades, was this: the man killed at the Garrett farm was not John Wilkes Booth. It was a look-alike, a patsy, a man named James William Boyd, a Confederate agent who bore a striking resemblance to the actor and had, coincidentally, also broken his leg around the same time. The real Booth, according to this legend, had been whisked away by a secret network of Confederate sympathizers, a clandestine organization known as the Confederate Secret Service. This is where our story truly begins, not with an ending, but with an escape. On the night of April 14th, after leaping from the president's box and shouting "Sic Semper Tyrannis" to a stunned audience, John Wilkes Booth did not flee Washington alone. His escape was meticulously planned. He met his accomplice, David Harold, and they rode south into Maryland, relying on a series of safe houses. But what if the plan was always more complex than a simple dash for the Confederate lines? What if the manhunt itself was part of the design? The theory posits that the real Booth and Harold split up shortly after crossing the Navy Bridge into Maryland. Harold, a simple-minded guide, was tasked with leading the double, James William Boyd, on a path that would be easily tracked. This decoy, with his broken leg and similar appearance, was the perfect red herring. He was the man seen by Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set the leg. He was the man ferried across the Potomac by Confederate agent Thomas Jones. He was the man who ultimately took refuge in the Garrett barn. Meanwhile, the real John Wilkes Booth, his leg only sprained, traveled a different, more secret route. He was met by a small elite team of operatives answerable directly to the highest echelons of the Confederate government in hiding. Their mission was not just to help him escape, but to erase him. They provided him with new identities, money, and a passage into a life of obscurity. He was too famous, too recognizable, and he knew too much. He was a liability. His survival was an embarrassment to both the victorious Union, which needed a dead villain, and to the defeated Confederacy, which needed to bury the evidence of its most desperate act. For years, Booth was rumored to have fled to England, to India, even to Japan. But the most persistent and perhaps most plausible story was that he settled in the American South, then drifted west, living under a series of aliases. He was a man haunted, not by guilt, but by frustration and a sense of failure. The South he had sought to avenge was crushed under Reconstruction. His name was cursed. His grand theatrical gesture had achieved nothing but tragedy. This brings us back to the man calling himself John St. Helen. In the early 1870s, he appeared in the dusty frontier town of Glen Rose, Texas. He was a bartender, a peculiar man with piercing black eyes, a dramatic bearing, and a fondness for whiskey and soliloquies. He was well educated, spoke with an actor's elocution, and had a pronounced limp he claimed was from an old injury. He became a local character, known for his volatile temper and his mysterious past. One day, facing a serious illness and believing he was on his deathbed, St. Helen called his friend and employer, a lawyer named Finis L. Bates, to his side. With feverish intensity, St. Helen revealed his true identity. He was John Wilkes Booth. He detailed the escape plot, named names, described the feeling of the derringer in his hand, the look on Lincoln's face. He spoke of the secret networks, the double, and his long, lonely exile. He gave Bates a photograph of himself, on the back of which he wrote, "To my friend and confidant, Finis L. Bates." Miraculously, St. Helen recovered and promptly vanished from Texas, leaving Bates with an unbelievable story and a signed photograph. For 25 years, Bates investigated. He tracked down leads, interviewed old Confederate soldiers, and became convinced that St. Helen was telling the truth. Then, in 1903, the story reached its final macabre chapter. In Enid, Oklahoma Territory, a drunken house painter named David E. George committed suicide by drinking strychnine. He was a destitute, broken man. But in his final moments, he too confessed to being John Wilkes Booth. The local undertaker, embalming the body, noted its striking resemblance to known photographs of Booth. Remembering the strange tales of the assassin's escape, he mummified the corpse. When Finis Bates read about the mummy in a newspaper, he traveled to Enid and was shown the body and immediately identified it as the same man he had known in Texas, John St. Helen. Convinced he now possessed the physical proof of history's greatest conspiracy, Bates bought the mummy. He wrote a book, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, and for years he toured the country with the mummy, exhibiting it at state fairs and sideshows as the genuine article. The Mummy of John Wilkes Booth became a sensation, a grotesque tourist attraction. People paid a dime to gaze upon the leathery, preserved face of the man who may or may not have killed the president. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, but Bates and his supporters presented a compelling case. The physical similarities were uncanny,
The timeline of St. Helen and George fit, and the deathbed confessions were too detailed and consistent to be entirely fabricated. The story of David E. George, the mummy and Finus Bates, is a bizarre and haunting coda to the Lincoln assassination. It is a story that refuses to die because it speaks to a deep-seated human suspicion that official narratives are often too neat, too convenient. The idea that a figure as monstrous as Booth could simply slip away, that history could so easily be manipulated, is terrifying and perversely thrilling. Was John St. Helen telling the truth? Was David E. George really the most famous assassin in American history? The U.S. government has repeatedly renounced requests to exhume the body buried in the Booth family plot. The body they insist is John Wilkes Booth. The mummy itself disappeared in the